All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new today. All the rest of y'all, what's up? How are we doing? What's your pain level like? I hate to say it. I had a flare-up this week. And it wasn't even my hip. Regular listeners know I did this whole series of talks and got the physical therapy and the MRI and all that stuff done, trying to get to the bottom of my pain in my hip. Well, my hip's been feeling fine. Haven't even having any pain. It's been feeling great for the last couple weeks. I've continued to do some of the things that I think were making a difference, and it's continued to keep the pain in my hip at bay. Of course, out of nowhere, I get this flare up in my back. I have these other places along my spine that have sometimes flared up at different times in my life. And those flare-ups are much more enigmatic. I mean, sometimes I can identify factors like I'm not sleeping enough, I'm not taking good care of myself. Sometimes it's like an anxiety thing that's getting expressed in my body. But this week, I have no idea. There was no anything I could tell that brought this on. I've been sleeping good. I've been doing good stuff for myself. I've been feeling okay. It's not like I was in a bad way at all. And then I took a totally benign step off of the porch onto my left foot. There was no weird way I landed. I've probably made this movement in my body hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and on any other day, it wasn't a problem. But for some reason this week, I stepped down on that foot. I could immediately felt it. There was a twinge right to that spot on my back, and I knew it right away. I was like, oh my God, why did that happen? That hasn't happened in a long while. And I actually do have one theory, but it's a little bit out there. And we actually talk about it today in my conversation with Monica Gauci, which I will tell you about in just a moment. So maybe I'll save that theory as to why I may have had a flare up this week to the other side so we can hear what I talk about with Monica first. But I have to say that there is this kind of overriding idea that happens a lot when people are addressing pain or when we're dealing with hypermobility, which I also talked to Monica about today. And this idea that is very prevalent is that the reason why something like that happens, the reason why my back would just go out over the most mundane of movements is that I'm not strong enough, or there's some inner muscles or something's not firing right in my body. And maybe that's true. Maybe that is the case. Maybe there's some kind of strengthening I need to do that would prevent me from having these kind of flare-ups. But I don't know. I don't know if it's just about strengthening. I think that there might be more at work in it. In any case, like I said, I'll save some of those thoughts till the other side because I do get into it today with my guest, Monica Gauci. And this is the first time I've ever spoken to Monica. I've spoken to her husband, Gregor, before. He's been on the show a few times. And, I'll be honest with you, the original reason why I had reached out to Monica had to do with a post that she had made that had to do with authorizations and certifications in the yoga world. And we kind of go there some, but we really didn't. Honestly, once we got into talking, I felt like the spirit of the conversation was going in a direction, and I didn't want to try to make us talk about something otherwise. So we kind of went to places that had to do with how you heal, which seems to me what Monica's most interested in and what I'm most interested in. And there's some conversations around certifications and authorizations and different approaches in yoga and how it all plays into a healing process. So it was wonderfully timed that this episode is posting this week, right when I had this flare up this week. And I really did enjoy getting to know Monica some and getting to hear some of her insights. It's quite wonderful. So I'm very happy to be sharing that with you today. Real quick before we get to it, I do want to express some gratitude to our podcast premium subscribers. Specifically today, I want to say thank you to Magdalena Banak and Sharon Ianu. Thank you, Magdalena and Sharon. Really appreciate your support. Honestly, I was looking at some statistics, some numbers for this show, which I really don't do very much. I used to do it a lot in the early years of the show. I would like monitor the numbers and see how many people were listening or not, or kind of like, I don't know, try to do like market research and stuff. And then you're supposed to do that so you can plan promotional stuff. But at some point, I just stopped. I just stopped paying attention to the statistics that we get for the show, because it's sometimes they're not very useful and they make me think about numbers rather than people. It's just not how I like to think about stuff. In any case, I did take a look at like the numbers and sort of compared them to how many people subscribe. And I gotta be honest, it was a little bit, I don't know what the word is. It was a little discouraging, maybe. Like, there's very few people out there who listen to this show on a regular who also are podcast premium subscribers. And I understand there's like 1 million subscriptions out there and everybody's asking you for another $5 a month or whatever. And I don't really want to be another person doing that. But unfortunately, it's kind of like the reality we're in right now. So even if like a few more people, like a very small percentage more of you who listen regular were to become podcast premium subscribers, it would make a really big difference for me and I would be super appreciative. So if you want to learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or find any of my other stuff, I love a whole range of things that are on offer. All those things can be found at jbrownyoga.com. All right, y'all. I think that's good for now. As usual, I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's listen to this conversation that I had with Monica Gauci. Hello?
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Monica.
How are you?
I'm doing okay, thank you. Pleasure to meet you like this, voice to voice.
Yes, pleasure to meet you as well.
I am already recording, and I'd like to consider us having just begun. Is that okay with you?
Yes, that's fine by me.
All right. Well, again, nice to have this chance to speak with you. I was trying to remember, and I can't really, but I know that one of the times that Gregor was here, he did mention to me some remote place that you were living at that time. It may have been some years ago. You might have moved. I don't know. Are you still living in the same remote place that you were living a few years back? I think maybe it was in New Zealand. Is that right?
No, we're in Australia. We're on the east coast of Australia, very close to Byron Bay, which is quite a famous spot for a lot of people. It's a very alternative community. I think I can safely say that. But it is probably one of the most beautiful places in Australia, and we're very fortunate to live high on a mountain. It takes us about 30 minutes to drive to Byron, but we can actually see the bay and the lighthouse from here, as well as another beautiful spot, which is called Wollumben. It's a famous mountain here, an important Aboriginal site. So, yeah, we have a beautiful spot. We're surrounded by old growth forest that has never been felled. And, yeah, I think every day I feel very fortunate to live here.
Well, when you say alternative community, what do you mean? Is that like an eco community or like?
No, it's more that there is a lot of yoga here. I'd say that most of the locals have been trained probably even to teach yoga. So yeah, there's a lot of yoga teachers here. There are a lot of healers, artists, musicians. I say alternative, and yeah, I was actually just talking to some friends the other day, and we were talking about how so many of the people here have migrated to this spot because they didn't fit into conventional society. And so we're a colourful lot. I think a lot of people have been the black sheeps of their family. I think I can probably safely say that I was in that category for most of my young adult life. And so I think we all feel that we fit here because we're all a little bit different in some way, or have been considered that way by others. So, yeah.
Well, that is in line with my early experiences with yoga as well, that it was a very counterculture move. Like, I'm definitely whatever, the black sheep in the family for getting into yoga. You know, I remember my dad saying to someone, "Oh, he's gazing at his navel and hugging trees," or something like that, you know?
Yeah, I started doing that very early in life as well. And that certainly wasn't the general thing that was done in the small country town that I lived in.
And that was a small country town in Australia?
Yes, that was in South Australia. Actually a lead smelting town, so, you know, not the prettiest of places. And I remember the first time really discovering the ocean, and I was just like, wow, this is so beautiful. And yeah, being somebody who really loves surrounding themselves with beauty, that really made me think I have to move and live closer to this. And yeah, we still live close to the ocean.
Well, I saw that it says you began your practice in 1978. And I was wondering, like, what does it look like in 1978? I always ask people this. I didn't come to yoga until like the early 90s in New York City. So I'm always curious, like, particularly like that early on, there just wasn't, I don't know that people who come into yoga now have a sense of how counterculture it was and how little yoga there actually was out there to find.
Yes.
So I'm wondering what it looked like to you. How did you end up discovering it at that time?
Well, actually, I was introduced to yoga by my boyfriend at the time, and he gave me a book and I wish I still had that book, but it was an Indian woman who was dressed in a, you know, long black cat suit, and it was all about yoga and how to cure menstrual pain, and which I had at the time. And so that was how I started. And then my best friend, who is still one of my dearest friends, Angela, and I went along to a local yoga class, and the woman was dressed in a similar outfit, but she wasn't Indian. And she was, you know, probably in her mid-50s. So I was 18, and I'm not proud of my first yoga class because we sort of hung out in the back and giggled most of the time. But what I do remember is that I was really struck by Shavasana, because I think I was a fairly uptight teenager, and just that conscious relaxation was revelationary to me. And I kept going. She didn't. And then I went on a yoga retreat, which was actually in Adelaide, the capital city of South Australia. So that was, you know, like a 2.5 hour drive away. And at this yoga retreat, I met all of these young people who were yoga teachers. And I was shocked, actually, because I thought you had to be old to be a yoga teacher. And so I was like, that's it. I'm moving to Adelaide and I want to do this yoga teacher training. And interestingly, because I didn't actually realize back then that I had such a strong sense of discernment, just personal discernment, it wasn't a judgment. But when I met the teacher who was holding the training, I was just like, no, I can't do this with her. She's not my teacher. And then I was incredibly fortunate and am still very grateful that I started going to classes by Shandor Remete. I don't know if you've heard of him.
The name sounds familiar. I don't know much about him.
He was an Iyengar yoga teacher at the time. And so I was 19 by now when I had moved to Adelaide. And he now does a style of yoga called shadow yoga.
Oh, and yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he was an incredibly dedicated yogi because, as you say, there weren't many yogis around. At that time in Adelaide, I think there were 2 yoga schools. There was his and there was the IYTA, the International Yoga Teachers Association, which was the other course that I was looking to do because they had a teacher training. Well, Shandor didn't have a teacher training, but he had 2 classes every day, Monday to Saturday. And I went along and realized that I was really stiff and really weak. And I thought, well, either I just forget about this or I get into it seriously. And so I chose the second option and I started going to every one of his classes. And I guess he saw that I was serious and he said to me in his gorgeous Hungarian accent, if you are serious, be here tomorrow morning, 4:00. And so actually at that stage of my life, I usually went to bed at about 1:00. So needless to say, I didn't get any sleep that night. And I rocked up at the studio punctually at 4:00. And we began, there was never anything said. And he was just incredibly generous. And he took me under his wing and I practiced with him every day, all day. And so if my memory serves me correct, we did a practice from 4 until 8, which included a half hour of shoulder stand and headstand and pranayama. And then we went back to his place. He was married. He was totally respectful to me. And he made me one of his goat's milk milkshakes. And we would wait until 10:00. We would rest, often reading the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, until 10 a.m. We would go back to the studio. He did class, which I still participated in, until 12. We went back to his place again for food, which, as far as I remember, he always fed me. He used to make homemade rye bread, and I remember all the details, and we would have lunch and again just study scripture until 3:00, and then we would go back to the studio and do another from 3 till 6, another session of all sorts of things. And then he would do another class from 6 to 8, and I either did that class or I went to work in the only vegetarian restaurant in Adelaide at the time as a waitress to earn my keep. And yeah, that was my real introduction to serious yoga, and still is a very big part of my foundation, because what Shandor taught me was how to observe and the finesse of working with, I say good alignment, but I don't mean that in an outward sense. I think he really taught me how to work from the inside out, because I developed a great sense of awareness of my body. And my body changed dramatically in that time. I went from being stiff and weak to being strong and flexible.
All right. Well, I have some questions because Shandor is a very mysterious man. He's and I've tried to get someone to come on and talk about shadow yoga, and nobody does. Like, they want to keep it secretive, which I very much respect.
Yes.
But I guess when you met him, it was an Iyengar influence. I thought I heard you say, but you also just said that he taught you how to work from the inside out, and that's not what I associate with Iyengar method. I associate the exact opposite of that. Was he parting ways from the Iyengar method and what he was teaching, or was he teaching like what Mr. Iyengar was teaching?
Well, maybe that was my own personal tendency. I think I've always had a tendency to be quite introverted with my practice, where I get my energy. What I mean by that is that I get my energy by going deeply inward and observing. And, my practice has been a great teacher for me. It has changed a lot over the years, but it's always been, as it is, I think probably for all of us, a great teacher in that way. Even if we don't realize it still happens. I think a lot of it was in the fact that Shandor didn't say a lot, that he left me a lot of space to explore, but definitely within quite a strict frame. Like he would sort of gently slap me on the back if I rounded my back in forward bends. So he was a strict teacher, and that was what I needed at that time, because I think I was an incredibly scattered teenager. I was quite rebellious because I had certain sort of things that had happened in my family that I was not happy with, and I was rebelling against that. I didn't quite have the tools and the qualities to be able to handle it in any other way. And so I think Shandor saved my life in many ways, because I don't know where I would be if I hadn't discovered that at that time in my life. I could have ended up on a destructive track.
I completely relate. A similar experience, and a teacher like that as well, who was like sort of hard edged, and it definitely served me at the time. I kind of wanted somebody to, but at a certain point, I did have to move on. I guess before though, I'm curious, did was he referring to what he was doing as shadow yoga at that time, or that wasn't until later?
No, that was later. That was much later. Yes. No, he referred to it as Iyengar yoga. And, like many teachers take on the style of their guru and their teacher. And he taught very much in that way. He had an incredibly expanded chest from the pranayama that he did. And, I don't say this in any negative way, but he would strut through the class and give instructions. And, he was always a very impressive teacher. Yoga wasn't a big thing back then, but his classes were, I'd say, relatively popular for how unknown yoga was.
I think it also is likely, and you can say from what you experienced, that at that time, even Iyengar yoga was less standardized in the ways that it became later. That I remember, I've had people on the show talk about how they did like jump back sun salutations with Mr. Iyengar, and years later, no one would ever have imagined that such a thing would have happened.
No. I do remember when I first started trying to teach Ashtanga yoga in Perth, which is the capital of Western Australia, because I know you're probably not familiar with some of how Australia's mapped out. And at that stage, Perth only had about 6 yoga schools. So this would have been in 19... I always have to map it on my age. So 1994. And they were all Iyengar schools and one Hatha yoga school, which was an ashram. So there were about 6 schools, I think, in total, maybe less. And so the Iyengar people who had a taste of Ashtanga yoga, but perhaps not taught in an accessible way, because anyway, that's another story. But so what happened was that I went to all the different Iyengar schools. I had been introduced to Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga and was loving it. And
wait a second, how did that happen? I mean, 1993 is when I started, and I started going to Jiva Mukti, and they were bringing the Ashtanga. They brought Patabhi Jois to the United States right at that time, and that is when it kind of sort of started to kind of take over, or with the first signs of it. When did you get it? How did you get exposed to Ashtanga Vinyasa?
So I had sort of, after I had done Iyengar-ish, at least, yoga with Shandor, I ended up moving to Switzerland to live for almost 5 years. And that was really difficult because there was, you could pretty well say, no yoga in Zurich at that time. And so Shandor had given me the name of a teacher that was teaching there, but he was teaching Hatha yoga, and I was more accustomed to something a little more physical. And it was all in German at that point. I didn't speak German. I had just arrived. And, we did like 6 gentle postures in a 2-hour class, and most of it was talking, and I didn't understand a word. So needless to say, I didn't continue with that. And yoga was not happening at all there. So, and I ended up managing a fitness center there. So I would actually teach what I called stretch classes, and I remember one of my students saying to me, "Why do we do a headstand at the end of the stretch class?" And I was like, "Oh, because..."
Don't tell anyone.
Because it's really good for you, is what I said. And so then I moved back to Australia, and I was like, well, I could live anywhere because I have no commitments. And so I decided to go and live in Byron Bay. And I started teaching yoga, what I had been taught from Shandor. And so I called it Iyengar yoga, although I had never actually personally trained with Iyengar. And then I heard about this Ashtanga yoga, and I signed up for a 3-week course with Louisa Sear, who was teaching Ashtanga back then, and she teaches her own style now. And so I did 3 weeks with her, and I just fell in love with it because I loved dancing. I should say I love to dance, and just the flow and the breath and the postures, it just really resonated with me, although I was pretty weak in my upper body because as an Iyengar yoga teacher, I just avoided what I wasn't good at. Because I have the freedom to do that. And I was never particularly good working on my hands. So it was a little bit of a challenge at first, but You had to get used to all those jump back and jump throughs, huh? Absolutely. And it was actually good for me. And I really noticed that developing my strength was quite empowering and really contributed to my self-confidence, because I wouldn't describe myself as a naturally self-confident person. I have developed confidence from my experience. From positive reinforcement from my own work and experience. So, and that was it. I sort of, started practicing Ashtanga yoga, but I had a lot of little problems along the way, just small things. And I guess my big goal was to, one of my big yoga goals was to study with Richard Freeman. And so it was actually after September 11, because I had big accident on September 11, which might be an interesting thing for us to delve into, because it was a yoga accident. And then shortly after that, Gregor, my husband, who you know because you have spoken with him, and I went to Boulder to study with Richard. And I'm the type of student who asks a lot of questions. And probably the reason I always encourage my students to ask questions. And I had a lot of questions, and a lot of them were still unanswered at the end of that course. And because I was having a lot of problems with my own body, it was also the coincidence that chiropractic became available as a degree in Perth. And so I had intended to study that as a degree when I was 26, which is when I ended up moving I moved to Switzerland when I was 28. So I had intended to go to university and study chiropractic then. And so it was like, I said to Gregor, I've always wanted to study chiropractic. And he said, well, why don't you? And I said, really? Shall I? And he was like, yeah, do it. I don't think we both realized what we're getting ourselves in for, because it's a pretty, demanding full-time 5-year degree. And so I went and did that. And that has totally changed my teaching, because now as a therapist, I can't teach what doesn't suit my students. And I also along the way discovered that I was inherently hypermobile, and that was one of the reasons I was having a lot of the problems that I was having, because I needed to be focusing on my strength, not on my flexibility. And, I always say to my students, flexibility is overrated. And that's the one downfall I see with yogis, is that they just think that they need to be more flexible than they need to be. And so, I wrote a blog article in, I think it was 2015, called Hypermobility, a Blessing or a Curse. And because I started noticing with my students, it was actually the flexible people who had the problems. The stiff people had challenges, but they didn't have.
Yes. And, maybe we could go back a little bit. I want to go where you just went in terms of hypermobility, because I'm in the same boat. I also think that people who were hypermobile, it was kind of exploited, because that was what made you advanced or whatever, like your ability to execute more intricate forms and have your feet on your head. And I guess I have to ask, you mentioned wanting to go study with Richard Friedman, and I had the same impulse, and I went to Boulder and met him too, just like you, probably years after you. But I know that you didn't first go study with Richard. You went to Mysore and studied with Patabhi Jois at the Shala there too, yeah?
That's right. So I think I had been practicing Ashtanga. Well, actually, so I stayed in Byron for 1 year, and then I left, because living in Byron Bay is a little bit like living in a womb. And I realized that I was not going to grow if I stayed there. And so that was when I moved to Perth, which was a bit of a rude shock, because, as I had done when I moved to Switzerland, once again, I had extracted myself from all of my friends and contacts and moved to a place where I didn't really know anybody. And it was really hard, because nobody would employ me as an Ashtanga yoga teacher. They were like, no, that's kick-ass yoga, that's boot camp yoga, the jumps. These were all the derogatory terms that the different teachers, schools that I went to said to me.
There were camps, weren't they? Yes.
They probably were. There's probably some truth actually in what they were saying, because of their experience of it. And, it can definitely be presented in that way. And So very shortly after being in Perth, I decided that I wanted to go to the source and go to Mysore. And that was where I met Gregor, actually. I met him on my first trip. I had been there, I think, for almost 2 months when I met him. And I went back a few times, but I did become quite critical of the system there. And so I stopped going. I think my last trip was in 1999.
I want to say something about that because I know, and it's kind of a theme that I've been picking at on the show for many years, because at that time, like even in 93, 94, when I came into yoga, if you wanted to have like any bona fides, you really did kind of need to be aligned with one of the traditions, one of the lineage traditions. Like those were the authorities for yoga.
Totally.
And, to like get authorization or whatever to be an Ashtanga teacher was a very nebulous process. There wasn't like, I don't know, the same kind of teacher trainings that we have now. I've talked to a number of different people who got those early authorizations. I read that you did get kind of authorized. All right,
yes, I did.
Kind of. What was that like? Did you get the tap on the forehead? Did they just tell you to bring the money? How did that happen for you?
It was very well known that the way you were authorized was when you were given the last posture of intermediate by Patabhi Jois. And there was not much else said or done. It was just like, that's it. You have it. Certification was a different thing. You had to complete the advanced series with him, although I do know a couple of people who actually bought their certification rather than officially doing it there.
Yes, I've heard. That's why I made that comment. I've heard that story too, where they just like, it cost a certain amount. That's where you got it.
I really do think that it was, maybe wise is not the right word, but it was a good thing to have some structure to whether or not somebody is authorized or certified. But what I don't think is that the way it is, probably, I don't even know, because I've really lost touch with Mysore and the way things run. But what I really disagree with is this ableism, where you are judged by what you are able to do. And I think this is the biggest flaw in the Ashtanga Vinyasa method, because what it does is it makes students ambitious. It creates a hierarchy, which is not what we want in yoga. And it's a very unfair one. And we would never do that in any other area. Like, you would never say to a bodily disabled person that you are less because of what you can't do physically. It would be so cruel and unkind. You would never do it. So why would you do that in yoga, to say that you are more advanced because you do advanced postures? I remember in Perth, we had this student, and he was a really dedicated student, and he had been practicing yoga with us for years. And unfortunately for him, back in his day, because he was an older gentleman, and when he had his knee surgery, because he had played a lot of sport in his youth, they removed completely his meniscus and didn't put anything back. So it meant that he would never, ever be able to do some of the lotus, or any, I should say, of the lotus positions. But to me, he was an advanced student because he had been practicing a long time and he had the inner qualities of a yogi. And I feel that's what determines a yogi, is whether or not they are reflective. They have a level of awareness, and especially they're aware of their divine communion with God, whatever you want to call it. That's what a yogi is. It has nothing to do with your performance of asana. And to me, that's devastating and ridiculous, I will also say.
I'm in complete agreement in terms of like asana being any kind of indicator of where you are in your yoga. It's very problematic. I will say that I certainly for a long time felt like it seemed like the Ashtanga system, the method, had it baked in, like this kind of, because it is like systems, there's 6 of them, and there's only like, Richard's like the only person who ever did all 6 or whatever, like there was always who could get the next posture. Even as you were saying, the way that you were authorized is that you stuck around long enough and got the posture, and that was what it was. Yes. And I think most people who had their yoga, like their progress in yoga, be measured by what poses they can do, it bit them back. Like you were saying, I had pain issues too. And they also, almost all of them went on to like explore other healing modalities. Like they had to.
Exactly. Yes. And, that was certainly the case for me, because I had hurt myself and couldn't do so much of what I identified myself with. That was the sad thing. And as a teacher, it was especially the teachers who would injure themselves because they felt this pressure that they needed to be better than their students. How sad. And that was what really made me look for other modalities that could help me to heal. And that's what my passion is now, is to actually educate students on how to heal themselves, because nobody knows their body better than we each know our bodies, because we live inside of it. We have this immediate sensory feedback about what we're feeling, what we're sensing. And so, my main thing is to teach students how to develop their awareness so that they, and give them tools as well that they can heal themselves.
Well, I think a lot of Ashtanga teachers would say that that's what they're doing. And a lot of times it isn't necessarily about the asana forms. It is sort of, how they're presented, I imagine, and the kind of viewpoint that the teacher holds in the presentation of it. I guess I am curious about how one of the things I read that you read back when like all the stuff came out about Patabhi Jois, I talked with Gregor about all that stuff. I remember what you had written, and one of the things that I thought was very interesting is something I've had people talk about, which is a little bit another thread that I personally find interesting in terms of how yoga teaching has evolved over the years, is that even as you said with Shandor, they didn't, in the like Ashtanga, Patabhi Jois and Sharat, didn't necessarily teach other stuff. That one of the reasons you were sort of like critical wasn't just because of the hierarchical power dynamics, but because it seemed to you, especially since you had previous experience, that they weren't teaching pranayama, or they weren't like holding like dharma talks. Like a lot of the Ashtanga teachers I've spoken to now do that stuff that Patabhi Jois never did. So that the criticism had to do with the way that yoga was being taught, not just the power dynamics, although I guess they were interwoven.
And that is why I call it Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga and not Ashtanga Yoga, because, Ashtanga Yoga is Patanjali's 8-limbed ancient yoga. And so I'm always careful to specify that it's Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga. And as you say, many teachers now do incorporate other limbs. And that was probably one of my dissatisfactions of being in Mysore, because you would do 2 hours of asana in the morning, and then Patabhi Jois would have a conference in the afternoon. But for me, the conferences I went to over those 4 years, there wasn't a lot of wisdom talk there, and it didn't. I was fortunate that I had a wisdom teacher. I already had a spiritual teacher, so I didn't really need that. At the same time, I felt that I wasn't learning anything apart from, the next posture. But
I'm sorry, I don't know who you're referring to when you said you already had a spiritual teacher. Who are you referring to?
I started my meditation practice in 1980 with Prem Rawat, and I do sometimes still see him because he comes to Australia when there's no pandemic. He does come to Australia quite close to where I live. He has a property there, and there is usually a 4 or 5 day retreat that happens most years. So yeah, I learned to meditate from him back then. And yeah, I don't always do his meditation techniques, but I do always meditate. That's just
and you thought of it seems to me the important part, and you kind of alluded to it earlier when you talked about what a yogi is in your mind.
Yes.
That you held your yoga practice in a very sacred, reverent way, that it had a spiritual component. That's what when I came into yoga, that's why I was interested in it. But over time, it did end up becoming more of like a fitness orientation a lot of times. And Ashtanga became one of the things that got into the gyms because it was sweaty.
Right. Yeah. I don't know about that because I never really went to the gyms to do that or taught there. But and now, and I think it's a great thing that yoga is taught in most gyms. Now if I lived in Switzerland and I was managing that fitness center, I'd be definitely putting on yoga classes. So there was something else I was going to say in relation to that.
Well, what I was going to say while you think about it is, it seems like if you were going to teach those yoga classes at the gym, though, that might be that there would be an expectation that those classes would be about strength and flexibility more than divinity. And I guess that's an interesting, I guess that's a question I would have because well, go ahead.
Jay, I try not to separate the limbs too much. There's two important things I want to say. One is, so that's one, and we can come back to that, and I'll just tease that out a little bit.
The divinity is in the strength and flexibility. That's what you're saying,
well, it's just that I see our body as being an expression of divinity. I very much, living in this incredible nature, you cannot help but recognize, experience fully that this is the divine manifest. And I see our bodies as the divine manifest. And my big message, I always feel like it's sort of under the guise of anatomical things, but my big message always to students is to teach them to love their body. Not because they look in the mirror and they think, wow, I look pretty good, I love my body. No, but to actually love this body like you love your child, or you love your partner, or you love your pet, or you love the things that you love because you care for them, because you appreciate their qualities, regardless of what it can and can't do. And that way you naturally care for your body, you naturally feed it well, you naturally do the asanas that support you in a way that nourishes you. Because there's just so much coercion and pushing and all of those horrible things in some Ashtanga Vinyasa classes.
And a lot of yoga classes, not just Ashtanga Vinyasa classes. I mean, Because when it's about, like we said earlier, if advanced means being able to do the pose that other people can't do, it invariably leads to a lot of too much on the body or a lot of imposition on the system.
Totally. And, the other thing I really wanted to say, and this is probably quite controversial, especially in the Ashtanga Vinyasa scene, to me, asana is asana is asana. It's all asana. I don't believe in a holy grail sequence that will help you to reach enlightenment. I think it's a myth. And if I'm anything, I'm definitely try to be a myth buster, because I see the spell that it has on people and how it deludes them into doing all sorts of things that actually don't serve them.
Yeah, so, I hear what you're saying. If I've completely let go of like the poses really mattering that much. I mean, yes, they do, but they don't in the sense that you said that there's no magical pose or magical sequence, and being able to accomplish forms is a very hollow pursuit. And then it's like what those forms might bring about in you, or what kind of awareness, like you were saying, what kind of sensitivity and your ability to notice and have a sense of your own divinity. It does kind of come back to that.
It does, yes.
That's really what the reason for doing the forms is. And there has been so much emphasis on the forms over the years because it's more tangible. I've often said, like, it's easier to sell somebody on being able to do handstands than like some subtle inquiry into the nature of your being.
That's right. And we all come to yoga in the way that we need it initially, and we all evolve at the pace that we need to evolve at. And so I have no judgment on where anybody's at, because I've probably been there. I'm sure I've been there. In fact, I've been around long enough and been doing this for long enough to have been through so many different stages.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because as we started this conversation, when we were talking about this earlier time of yoga wasn't really being presented as this like co-creative thing that you get to help evolve. It was kind of presented as these lineage traditions that you were supposed to give yourself over to. And Absolutely. A lot of us tried, but didn't really feel right. So people were always kind of rebelling from it from early on. But even more recently, particularly over the last few years, that kind of sense of those lineage traditions being the authorities, that all did fall apart because they all did horrible shit. Excuse my language. But at some point, it seems like there has been a pretty huge evolution, because all those people you mentioned, Shandor and that other teacher, they all have gone on to have different approaches, right? Yes. And like we said, teachers have gone on to like bring in new modalities. I guess what's interesting is now that sort of things are kind of coming back in line some after pandemic, however weird it is now, but it's not all locked down. It does seem like some people are kind of going back, and it's like, well, how much are we going back to the way things are before? Are we still looking to an institution to have the authority? Because you said earlier you want to have a way to authorize teachers, but it's very problematic, because when the nature of yoga is divinity and a person's own individual felt experience, standardizing that or coming up with some kind of objective metrics for what makes you qualified in that is kind of what's led to so much trouble.
Yeah, I think, nothing substitutes practice, obviously. That is what makes you an authentic.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.